World War and Cold War. Historical lies. Were we witnesses to the greatest deception in modern history? Did millions die in a war whose true purpose remains hidden to this day? The technologies, industrial capacities, and production methods developed during the war ultimately had a very beneficial long-term side effect for our world. The story we have been told about the Cold War would be a deliberate deception. The people in East and West would have been systematically manipulated for decades, with fabricated enemy images that were not real. The solution to this supposed dilemma was a fictional conflict, the so-called Cold War, or East-West conflict. Within this staged enmity, the white nations fought one another, at least officially. East and West moved in lockstep with their technological and military efforts. If the two superpowers were only fighting a fictional battle, there was never any real danger of escalation, and therefore no real danger of a total nuclear annihilation of the world. This supposed threat scenario had, for all those decades, always been nothing but a lie and a deception. The Second World War, the historical lie. For decades, we have been constantly flooded with films, documentaries, and books about the Second World War. The images of bombed-out cities, battles, and human suffering are deeply and firmly anchored in our collective memory. Yet while we know these symptoms of the war in every detail, one fundamental question still remains unanswered. What was this war really about? To me personally, this constant focus and media presence of the World War has seemed increasingly strange in recent years. One might think people would want to forget this terrible time. Yet interestingly, it is constantly recalled. And despite all the reporting, films, and documentaries, it was ultimately never clear to me what this war was really about, what purpose it served. We see plenty of action and drama, but we don't become any wiser. It almost feels as if this media flood of World War content is a deliberate cover-up. People are kept busy with emotional stories and scenes of action so that they do not ask about the systematic changes. In public perception, the Second World War is often portrayed as a so-called good war, a fight against fascism, in which the Western democracies and the Soviet Union ultimately came together to defeat Hitler. But the common portrayal overlooks the long-term consequences of the war. The World War brought about far-reaching modernization both in the Western world and in the Soviet Union, and within a very short time it led to truly unprecedented advances in the automotive industry, aviation, electronics, communications, and nuclear technology, developments that firmly cemented economic and military superiority over the rest of the world for many decades to come. One could even say that during the war years, the Western world and the Soviet Union went through an intense industrial and technological drastic cure. And finally, the Western world was also politically and structurally centralized and integrated. From fragmented nation-states emerged an integrated, centralized world order that still exists to this day. The crucial question is, were these profound transformations really just a natural consequence of the war, or were they, from the very beginning, the actual goal? What if the World War was not a tragic accident of history, but a deliberately staged event to transform the world? Were we witnesses to the greatest deception in modern history? Did millions die in a war whose true intention is still being concealed to this day? Was the war a means to an end for a far-reaching social and economic transformation? This documentary puts forward the thesis that the Second World War was not a historical accident, but was deliberately brought about and carefully and intentionally staged to achieve precisely this transformation of the world. A transformation that continues to shape and define global structures to this very day. In the following first chapter, we will look at the technological and industrial developments during the Second World War. The second chapter deals with the new institutional world order that emerged in the final years of the war and still exists to this day. Technological leaps in the Second World War. What really happened to the world between 1939 and 1945? Officially, nations were said to be fighting over territory, ideologies, and political dominance. Yet when we look more closely at the sweeping technological and industrial transformation of that entire period, another question indeed arises. Did the World War ultimately serve as an immense catalyst for an unprecedented modernization of Western industry itself? In 1914, armies still went to war with horse-drawn artillery and crude vehicles, little more than wagons with bolted-on engines. Aircraft were fragile wooden frames, and communication relied on field telephones and carrier pigeons. In 1945, the war ended with jet aircraft, rockets, radar, computers, and nuclear weapons, marking the dawn of the atomic age. Within just a few years, the technological landscape of the world had been completely transformed. This transformation was no accident. The World War forced entire nations into an unprecedented mobilization of their industrial and scientific resources. What began as a military necessity gradually evolved into a systematic reorganization of Western production capacities, a drastic industrial cure that laid the groundwork for the technological and economic dominance over the rest of the world. The crucial question is this: was this massive buildup of industry and technology merely a reaction to the circumstances of war, or was it part of a long-term plan for technological and economic dominance? Could it, in fact, have been about creating a systematic global superiority, not just between individual nations, but between the entire West and the Soviet Union and the rest of the world? Before the First World War, warfare was shaped largely by craft and mechanics. Handcrafted rifles, simple artillery, and cavalry dominated. Mass production was hardly common. Weapons were mostly produced regionally. Horses and ships were the main means of transport. Railways were slowly being added. Communication took place mainly through messengers and visual signals, supplemented by wired telegraphy to a limited extent. The First World War initiated a fundamental change. Industrial production increasingly determined military strength. Craft production gave way to the industrial mass production of military goods. The Second World War. The scientific and technological explosion. The Second World War was a war of science, in which technological development and research played central roles. It brought profound advances in aviation. Fighter planes like the British Spitfire and the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 set new standards for speed and agility. In the United States, the B-17 Flying Fortress was developed as a strategic long-range bomber for large-scale air raids during the war. By the very end of the war, a major technological leap followed. The Messerschmitt Me 262 became the very first operational jet aircraft ever used in combat, a clear harbinger of the coming jet age. The Second World War marked a decisive technological advance in tank development and ushered in a completely new phase of mechanized warfare. Technically advanced models like the Tiger I and the King Tiger stood as clear symbols of this leap. Massive, heavily armored combat vehicles with exceptional firepower and refined targeting optics. Radar was used for the very first time to detect aircraft and ships. Systems like Britain's Chain Home network greatly improved air defense. Improved German submarines, such as the Type 7, initially dominated the Atlantic. Sonar and radar provided decisive countermeasures. The German V-2 rocket opened the rocket age and was a forerunner of space travel and intercontinental missiles. The Manhattan Project led to the development of the first atomic bombs. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked the entry into the nuclear age. From that moment on, nuclear power became one of the most decisive technologies of the 20th century. Computers and cryptography. The first programmable computer, Colossus, was developed to decrypt German radio messages. It becomes clear that the Second World War drastically accelerated technological development. Industrial mass production replaced craft manufacturing. Factories became the centers of weapons production. Science and technology became crucial. Chemists, physicists, and engineers were as strategically important as generals. In wartime, nations are under extreme pressure of resources and time to be technologically superior, or at least to keep up. Researchers and engineering teams received enormous funding and strong political backing to deliver rapid solutions. Projects that in peacetime would have taken years or even decades were achieved within months or just a few years. A prime example of this was the Manhattan Project, where vast financial and human resources were concentrated, contributing decisively to the rapid development of nuclear physics and later nuclear energy. The global race for technology led to a convergence of standards. New generations of tanks consistently featured tracked drives, fully enclosed turrets, and radios. Aircraft became all-metal monoplanes with one or more engines and noticeably higher speed. Espionage, licensing agreements, and captured war material led to the adoption and copying of enemy technologies. Technical convergence was the result. All major powers deliberately invested in the expansion of their key industries. In metallurgy, high-strength steels and light metals like aluminum were processed on an unprecedented scale. Engine construction experienced a surge, from the traditional combustion engine through modern diesel systems to turbine technology. At the same time, vast production capacities emerged, with new factory facilities, streamlined assembly line work, and technically trained personnel. The Second World War acted as a catalyst for technological and scientific innovations whose effects still endure today in areas such as vehicle manufacturing, aerospace, computers, communication technology, radar technology, and nuclear energy. Total mobilization of industry during the Second World War. The industrial expansion was enormous. Factories were converted, new production sites were built in record time, and civilian companies were integrated into military supply chains. In the United States, gigantic manufacturing complexes arose, some on undeveloped land, transferring modern assembly line work to war production. General Motors, Ford, and other corporations transformed into high-performance producers of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. In Germany and Britain, too, industry was massively expanded under state control, with centralized planning, forced labor, and technical standardization. With the outbreak of war, there was a complete shift to war production. Industry was drawn into the logic of war, directed, supported by propaganda, and radically intensified. USA, the arsenal of democracy. With the Lend-Lease Act of 1940, massive arms deliveries to Allied nations began. After Pearl Harbor in 1941, the War Production Board took control of industry. Under the Victory program, millions of weapons, vehicles, and rounds of ammunition were produced in the shortest time. The Ford plant at Willow Run built one B-24 Liberator per hour, a symbol of industrial war machinery. The Rosie the Riveter campaign targeted female workers. Millions of women worked in factories, replacing men who had gone to war, and kept the vital arms production running. Between 1942 and 1945, around 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and 6,000 warships were produced. Germany, the total war. Under Albert Speer as armaments minister, Production was centralized, streamlined, and industrialized. Designs were simplified, production lines standardized. Millions of forced laborers were integrated into the armaments economy. Propaganda accompanied production. In 1943, Goebbels called for total war. In the Soviet Union, too, industry was completely converted to armaments as the war began. Under centralized state control, entire factories from the western parts of the country were dismantled and rebuilt east of the Urals to protect them from the German advance. Despite immense losses and destruction, the Soviet war economy produced millions of rifles, tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces, with a strong focus on mass production, simple construction, and rugged functionality. Military innovation as the foundation of modern technology. Many technologies we take for granted today were originally created for military purposes. The demands of the World War led to developments that, after the war, were systematically transferred to civilian applications. Aviation. The development of powerful military aircraft during the Second World War paved the way for civilian passenger aviation. Civilian planes already in service, like the Douglas DC-3, were widely used during the war in a military version, the C-47, and after the war they played a decisive role in driving the expansion of civil air transport. Crucial for air defense and early warning during the Second World War, radar was after the war the basis for civilian air traffic control and meteorology. Computers. In the United States, the ENIAC emerged as one of the first electronic computers, designed to calculate ballistic trajectories for the military. Although it became operational shortly after the war ended, it laid the foundation for later digital infrastructure, just like the British Colossus, which decrypted German radio messages. Nuclear energy. The Manhattan Project led not only to the atomic bomb, but also to the civilian use of nuclear energy. Synthetic materials. Substances like nylon and plexiglass were developed during the war and later widely used in fashion and consumer goods industries. The myth of Reconstruction. After the Second World War, the rebuilding of Germany and Western Europe was often portrayed as a success story, an economic miracle born of hard work, sacrifice, and initiative. In the United States, too, the idea took hold that the Western democracies had rebuilt themselves through their own strength, while authoritarian states had economically fallen behind. In the United States, the prevailing notion is that the country rose to economic leadership after the war thanks to its pioneering spirit, democracy, and the free market. Far less discussed is the fact that the U.S. maintained a highly industrialized war economy and, after the war, deliberately shifted it toward export. Many historians and economists argue that the foundations of Reconstruction were not laid in the post-war years, but during the war itself. The technological and industrial lead of Western Europe and the United States was, to a large extent, built on wartime investments and innovations. The war economy left behind a highly capable infrastructure that, after the war, could be redirected toward the production of consumer goods. America's economic growth after 1945 still relied heavily on the preservation of its military production structures. The arms economy ensured full employment, generated major investments in technology and infrastructure, and preserved an industrial base that continued well beyond 1945. Conclusion. The Reconstruction after the Second World War was not simply a success story built on its own, but relied heavily on structures created during the war. Industrial capacity, the organization of the arms economy, and technological knowledge formed the basis for the economic restart. From war industry to export dominance. After the Second World War, the United States, Britain, France, and increasingly West Germany possessed enormous industrial capacities. These had been massively built up during the war to produce millions of tanks, aircraft, ships, weapons, and ammunition. These production capacities created during the war were not dismantled after 1945, but converted to civilian goods. They became one of the key foundations for the economic upswing and the broad technological modernization throughout the Western world. Numerous industrial companies were expanded technologically, logistically, and organizationally by the wartime economy. General Motors had produced, among other things, tanks and engines during the war and greatly expanded its production, a capacity from which civilian vehicle manufacturing directly profited after the war. Ford, in its Willow Run plant, had built one B-24 bomber per hour, an industrial achievement of unprecedented scale, and after 1945, converted that capacity to mass production of passenger cars. General Electric, which had supplied the Army with radio equipment, electrical systems, and radar, now focused on consumer and household electronics. Boeing expanded its expertise in military transport and bomber aircraft and, in the decades that followed, rose to become the world's leading manufacturer of civilian airliners. In Germany as well, industry was shifted to civilian production. Volkswagen, originally founded for the KDF car, a people's car planned by the Nazi regime, quickly resumed series production under British supervision. In the 1950s, the VW Beetle became an icon of the West German economic miracle and a global export success. BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Opel made use of their expanded production capacities after the war for civilian car manufacturing. Siemens relied on its experience in producing electronic military equipment and grew into a world leader in electrical engineering. The chemical conglomerate IG Farben was broken up after the war into BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst, but all three companies built on their wartime production and achieved a dominant position in the global chemical and pharmaceutical industries. All of these companies were massively developed during the war, technologically, logistically, and organizationally. After 1945, they took on central roles in the Western export economy. Their existing factories, machinery, logistics networks, and management structures continued seamlessly. Only the production goal changed. The thesis of the drastic cure of the Western world. The Western states went through a drastic industrial cure in the 1940s, a forced transformation driven by total war in which entire societies were shifted to maximum production. During the war, entire industries were centrally coordinated. Production processes were geared toward mass manufacturing. New technologies were developed and implemented under intense pressure. Production volumes and speeds rose to unprecedented levels. This created, within just a few years, industrial capacity and know-how that would have taken decades under peacetime conditions. After the war, the massive production capacities were shifted to civilian output. Military aircraft factories became sites for civilian production. Vehicle plants switched from tanks to cars. Electronics and communications technology flowed into consumer products. Logistical and organizational structures were simply kept in place. The war was the means to create a new world, not by accident, but by design. After the war, the Western industrial nations were ready to dominate the world markets. The Western world as a global export power. The Western countries went on to dominate the global market with high-quality industrial goods, vehicles, and technology. This dominance was the result of deliberate transformation processes, not just mere competitiveness. The Western world entered the civilian export market with a wartime-driven, highly developed industrial infrastructure, with production capacities that were unmatched anywhere in the world. Many of the technologies developed during the war were placed under strict patent protection after 1945, creating a double effect. Western companies were now able to export their products all over the world. Companies in Africa, Asia, or Latin America had no access to this knowledge and remained heavily dependent on imports. This control of patents became one of the key mechanisms to safeguard the technological lead and to prevent others from ever catching up. At the same time, the Global South was systematically pushed into the role of raw material supplier and sales market. Former colonies were turned into economic dependencies. Development loans were tied to Western companies, products, and standards. Independent industrialization initiatives were slowed down or redirected. Examples can be found in India, Egypt, and Ghana, where local attempts at industrialization were blocked or steered in certain directions by the conditions imposed by the World Bank and the IMF. This New World Order was stabilized by international institutions. GATT, from 1947, promoted the removal of tariffs and trade barriers, a move that mainly benefited Western industrial exporters. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank controlled capital flows and often tied infrastructure investments to Western suppliers. These structural pillars allowed a managed globalization under Western dominance. Conclusion: the long-term strategy behind the economic rise. The thesis that the Western nations were subjected to a drastic cure through war to massively expand their industries and achieve global dominance is supported by historical facts. The United States and Western Europe built up a highly industrialized production base during the war, a base that, after 1945, was not dismantled but deliberately redirected towards civilian exports. The Western world entered the civilian export market with a war-driven, highly advanced industrial infrastructure, carrying production capacities that truly had no equal anywhere else in the world. Africa, Asia, and Latin America, in turn, largely became markets for Western goods, without ever being granted access to the most modern technology. Many of today's leading global industrial companies, including GM, Ford, VW, and Siemens, gained enormously from the post-war conversion of wartime production capacities into civilian export goods after the Second World War. The industrial infrastructure built during the conflict, along with the accumulated technical know-how and significant government support, allowed them to recover rapidly and to expand into international markets. The Western world underwent a forced industrial transformation through the war, which in the long run led to global economic and technological dominance. The industrial restructuring brought about by the Second World War led to a global export order in which the Western world systematically expanded and institutionally secured its technological and economic dominance, an order whose basic structures remain in place to this day. When we speak of technology and industry, we should not forget the long-term military significance of the technological leaps made during the Second World War. The Second World War pushed humanity into a new era, and nothing symbolizes that more powerfully than the atomic bomb. Developed in the secret Manhattan Project, it was far more than just a weapon. It marked a military turning point that revolutionized warfare and permanently altered the global balance of power. In 1942, the Manhattan Project began under General Leslie Groves and J. Robert Oppenheimer. With a budget of $2 billion, today about 30 to 40 billion, it brought together thousands of scientists at sites like Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford. In just 3 years, it mobilized resources that would otherwise have taken decades. The war became the decisive driver. Fear of a German atomic program pushed the creation of a military superweapon meant to end the conflict swiftly and decisively. Even though the German effort collapsed, that threat justified the urgency. The goal was simple: to forge a strategic weapon that would give the United States clear superiority. The atomic bomb was not only an instrument of destruction, It marked the dawn of the nuclear age. It did lay the groundwork for civilian nuclear power, yet its true meaning lay in its military dimension. In 1945, it showed the world the power to wipe out entire cities with a single blast. It was not merely a scientific breakthrough, but a tool of military dominance that irreversibly changed the nature of warfare and firmly positioned the United States as the leading power. The Manhattan Project drove innovations in nuclear physics, computer technology, industrial production, and engineering, advances that extended well beyond the bomb itself. With the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the United States ended the war and clearly showed a military superiority that made them a superpower. One bomb alone could wipe out cities and reshape the balance of world power. Until 1949, when the first Soviet nuclear test took place, America held a nuclear monopoly that shaped the post-war order. The atomic bomb became a symbol and instrument of military deterrence, allowing the United States to project its power worldwide. Nations without nuclear weapons were pushed down the global hierarchy, dependent on superpowers like the United States, and later the Soviet Union. Conclusion: Technology and industry in World War II. The Second World War was more than just a massive military event. It was a historical turning point in which the Western world underwent an industrial and technological drastic cure and an unprecedented wave of modernization. This change cemented its technological and economic superiority over the rest of the world for decades to come. In the face of the war, technological innovations were pushed forward, industrial production capacities were radically expanded, and entire societies were shifted toward armaments production. This wartime infrastructure formed the essential basis for the Western nations' worldwide economic dominance in the years after the war. The Western world dominated the global export market through technological superiority, and the industrial capacities expanded during the war. This Western dominance was not the product of spontaneous innovation or free market forces, but the result of a planned, war-driven transformation that continues to shape the world today. For all the focus on civilian industrial and technological dominance, one crucial aspect must not be overlooked. The technological and industrial transformation did not apply only to civilian uses. The massive military innovations of the Second World War, above all nuclear weapons, but also rocket technology, modern tanks, long-range bombers, and jet aircraft, laid the foundation for the long-term military dominance of the Western powers, including the Soviet Union, over the rest of the world. These military achievements carried seamlessly into the post-war era and were strategically expanded during the Cold War. It was here, in the military realm, that it became most strikingly clear how fully the Second World War had created a technological platform whose strategic value was secured for decades. We will return to this development and its lasting significance later in the chapter on the Cold War. Integration and consolidation: the emergence of a new world order. World history is usually portrayed as a long series of conflicts, with nations struggling and fighting for power, for territories, or at times driven by ideology. But what if this well-established perspective only barely scratches the surface? When one carefully looks at the geopolitical structures before and after the World War, an alternative thesis becomes clear. The war may, in fact, have been deliberately used to consolidate the Western world, and to integrate it under a single, centralized control. Before the First World War, the Western world was marked by fragmentation and rivalry. The Western world was divided into nation-states, each driven by imperial ambitions. The British Empire, the German Empire, and the French colonial realm stood in constant rivalry with one another. There was barely any coordinated effort in the economy or technology. shared industrial networks simply did not exist, and supranational cooperation was rare. International trade operated under the gold standard, yet there was no central economic steering as we know it today through the European Union or the World Trade Organization. Political instability was significant. Alliance systems created opposing blocs among the great powers, but they never resulted in true economic integration. The interwar period, from 1918 to 1939. Despite the founding of the League of Nations in 1920, international relations remained marked by instability. Europe was economically devastated, while the United States rose to become the leading global economic power. Yet genuine international cooperation still did not exist. The economic crisis of 1929 even deepened the isolation of the individual countries. Germany remained isolated by the Treaty of Versailles, while the United States largely stayed out of European affairs. There were no supranational organizations like those that would emerge after the Second World War. This makes it clear, despite the devastating experience of the First World War, there was no substantial integration of the Western world. The situation after the Second World War presents a striking contrast. Within just a few years, a complex network of international organizations and alliances emerged, gradually uniting the Western world under American leadership. In only 5 years after the end of the war, significantly more major international organizations were created than in the entire 150 years before. In 1945, the United Nations was founded with the mission to firmly safeguard world peace. In 1949, the Council of Europe followed, aimed at promoting democracy and protecting human rights across Europe. In 1944, the Bretton Woods system was created with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The IMF closely oversaw the international monetary system, while the World Bank took on the task of financing vital development projects. In 1948, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation was founded to coordinate the Marshall Plan. That massive program ran from 1948 to 52, organizing and directing the US-backed reconstruction of Europe. In 1947, GATT established basic trade rules for the Western markets, laying down the foundation for decades of commerce. In 1949, NATO was founded as a military defense alliance. Was this integration an intended goal of the war? Before the war, the Western world was fragmented. Afterward, it was integrated. The war made it possible to break down national resistance and to install global structures. Economic and technological control was centralized through supranational organizations. The World War was not merely the result of geopolitical rivalries, but a deliberately used, or even carefully staged, event intended and designed to destroy old political and social orders, and to replace them with a new, centrally organized social structure. The Cold War as an instrument of consolidation. The Second World War destroyed the old, fragmented world order and created the basis for a new Western integration. Before 1939, the Western world was shaped by national rivalries and imperialist competitions. There were no supranational structures, no US-led alliances, and no coordinated economic policy among the great powers. In 1945, Europe lay in ruins. This destruction created an emergency that allowed the United States to step in as a savior and impose its own conditions for reconstruction. The traumatic experiences of war, fascism, and total destruction were deliberately used as arguments for a new, centralized order. Through multilateral cooperation and economic interconnection, the disasters of the past were meant to be prevented. The emerging Cold War solidified the new order and provided the justification for a lasting Western integration under US leadership. After 1945, there suddenly existed a shared external threat from the Soviet Union, which made close Western cooperation seem absolutely essential and existentially necessary. Between 1945 and 1950, a close political, economic, and military interconnection of Western Europe emerged under U.S. leadership, an integration that had never existed in this form before. The Cold War ensured that this new order did not remain merely temporary, but instead solidified over the course of decades. The external threat from the Soviet Union legitimized U.S. dominance and prevented European countries from returning to true national independence. The crucial question: was it coincidence or a plan? Either Western integration was a natural reaction to the experiences of the war and the Soviet threat, and the United States opportunistically seized the opportunity that presented itself. Or it was a deliberate plan, and the Second World War served as the chosen means to destroy the old world order and to carefully establish a new, US-centered one. The Cold War then became the key instrument used to permanently legitimize this new order. The striking systematic nature and the very speed with which the new order was established rather suggest a deliberate plan. Before the war, a fragmented Western world with no central steering. The Second World War, destruction of the old order and the weakening of the European powers. After the war, rapid establishment of a US-centered system of international institutions. Cold War, an external threat legitimized this new order for decades. The Second World War, from this perspective, appears not only as a conflict over territories and ideologies, but as a transformative and truly defining event that made possible a new, centralized world order, one that was no longer based primarily on territorial control, but instead on economic, technological, and institutional dominance. The traumatic experiences of war and destruction were explicitly used as a warning to underline the urgency of a centralized and cooperative world order. The new political, economic, and military structures were meant to prevent future wars, secure stability, and lead the Western world into a cooperative, rules-based order. Many of the newly founded institutions explicitly referred in their founding documents to the experiences of the Second World War as both a historical warning and the central justification for their very creation. Without the Second World War, it would have been highly unlikely for the Western countries to ever voluntarily join a US-led order. The Cold War then ensured that this new order would remain firmly in place for the long term. While official history tends to focus on strategies, battles, and political decisions, one central perspective remains in the shadows: the perspective of ordinary people. The population has always been the one that suffered most from these historical processes. While elites pursued their strategic goals, it was the people in the streets who faced the real consequences: death, hunger, loss, and then the hardship of rebuilding. Before every major war, there was massive public resistance. First World War. Before 1914, the public in most countries showed little desire for war. Labor movements and socialists warned of a fratricidal war among ordinary people. But within just a few months, public sentiment shifted, nationalism flared up, and people were drawn into war. Weeks of war propaganda gradually turned the enemy into a monster. The myth of German soldiers spearing Belgian babies was widely spread, a calculated lie used to mobilize for war. Second World War. After the horrors of the First World War, pacifism had become widespread across Europe. In the 1930s, as many as 95% of Americans opposed getting involved in European conflicts. In both France and Britain, the willingness to go to war was initially very low. Roosevelt had promised to keep the United States entirely out of the war. Then came Pearl Harbor, a partly provoked and highly publicized attack, and the public mood shifted dramatically. Whether Pearl Harbor in 1941 or the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, in many cases these were staged or exaggerated events meant to break the resistance of the people. During the Cold War, The population was trained for decades to fear the enemy. Some hated the communist world conspiracy, others the capitalist imperialism. After every war, it was not the politicians, but the ordinary people who rebuilt everything in the end. After 1918, many men were dead or maimed, and women had to take over the work and feed their families alone. After 45, the rubble women cleared the destroyed cities, while the United States used the Marshall Plan for political control. The history of major wars and geopolitical maneuvers is also the history of entire populations being instrumentalized. They were lied to, made to accept wars they never wanted. They were killed in conflicts that served the interests of others. They had to rebuild what others had destroyed. They carried the burden, often across generations. Conclusion: Second World War. The historical lie. At the beginning of this documentary, we asked what the Second World War was actually supposed to accomplish. The answer to this question may emerge in the pattern that becomes visible when we look at historical developments through the lens of our formulated theses. The Western world and the Soviet Union, or to put it even more clearly, the entire white world, went through an intense industrial and technological crash course. This truly unprecedented modernization firmly cemented their technological and economic dominance over the rest of the world for many decades to come. The Second World War was a significant period of technological innovation, rapidly accelerated by the pressing demands of the conflict. The technologies, industrial capacities, and production methods developed during the war ultimately had a very beneficial long-term side effect for our world. After the war, they were transferred into the civilian economy and laid the foundation for global export dominance. However, the long-term strategic importance of the military innovations from the Second World War must not be overlooked. These innovations not only created military superiority during the war itself, but also served after the war as a technological platform for sustained military dominance of both the West and the Soviet Union over the rest of the world. The arms buildup during the war laid a highly advanced technical and industrial base. This base was further developed after the war in the following Cold War, whose dynamics we will analyze in the next chapter. At the same time, a political and structural unification of the Western world took place. Sovereign nation-states gave way to a rules-based order shaped and maintained by international organizations, supported by military, economic, and institutional leadership structures. It appears as if the chaos caused by the war was deliberately used to enforce this new global architecture. The white world was thus prepared for a new global era. Meanwhile, in the East, a second independent power bloc emerged under the leadership of the Soviet Union. The Eastern and Western blocs together formed a new bipolar post-war order. This brings us to the crucial question: were we witnesses to the greatest deception in modern history? Did millions die in a war whose true purpose remains hidden to this day? Personally, I believe that this is exactly the case. The World War was used as an instrument to carry out a deliberate plan. The white world was rapidly upgraded technologically, industrially, and militarily within a short period. And under the umbrella of international organizations, a new world order emerged. Of course, it is very difficult to conclusively prove our suspicions. We have no clear, irrefutable documents available that would definitively demonstrate the World War was a deliberate means to an end. Such documents will most likely never be accessible to ordinary people like us. But when we look back over the past several decades, at the time of the World War and later the Cold War, a full and clear picture emerges that makes our theses appear quite realistic. When taking a broad macro perspective, without getting lost in details such as battles, death, and destruction, a picture emerges that, in hindsight, appears quite suspicious. If we consider this accumulation of technological, industrial, and societal changes and become fully aware of the significant long-term benefits they brought to our world, it leads us to suspect that these changes did not arise merely as a spontaneous reaction to the war, but were deliberately and carefully planned. Perhaps in the end, it is only a feeling, and the final proof for our theses is lacking. But not all feelings deceive, and one does not always need clear evidence in hand to know that something is wrong, and perhaps has been for a very long time. This documentary offers a new perspective on the Second World War and the important question of what purpose it truly served. A perspective that may be closer to the truth than any other explanation offered so far. The Cold War, a lie. After the Second World War, the world gradually divided into two seemingly opposing blocs. The West, led by the United States, with NATO, founded in 1949, and the East, led by the Soviet Union, with the Warsaw Pact, founded in 1955. This bipolar world order would go on to shape international politics for more than 4 decades and forced many nations across the globe to take sides. At the center of our analysis lies the thesis that the East-West conflict never truly existed. It was, in fact, a deliberate lie. People in both East and West are white. The hostility between East and West was carefully staged and merely pretended. This provocative thesis fundamentally challenges the core assumption of the official version of history. The conventional narrative presents the Cold War as an inevitable and deep-rooted conflict between two irreconcilable systems: the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. A critical examination of the Cold War reveals an alternative interpretation. The hostility between the superpowers may have been carefully staged, a calculated geopolitical performance that granted both sides identical strategic advantages. In terms of foreign policy, this situation can also be compared to the well-known good cop, bad cop mechanism, in which two actors publicly adopt opposing positions, while in truth cooperating closely behind the scenes. This is a crucial line of thought. If the East-West conflict was not what it was claimed to be, then many social, economic, and military measures on both sides were not legitimized by a genuine threat, but rather by a deliberately fabricated threat, one that, in reality, never truly existed. If the threat wasn't real, then these measures were based on a deliberate lie and may have served an entirely different purpose. The real question is, what purpose did they truly serve? Benefits of a staged Cold War. The supposed threat posed by the ideological opponent was used by both sides to implement far-reaching social and political measures. Measures that, without such justification, would likely have been far less acceptable to the public. Military measures and arms race. In the United States, the East-West conflict was used to justify permanent armament and the militarization of society. It also led to the founding of NATO, officially to defend against communism, and to the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Both were direct interventions based on the claim that communism had to be stopped. The conflict also served to justify American hegemony over Western Europe, Japan, and large parts of the world, a global empire under the banner of defending the free world. The so-called Soviet threat justified massive military spending and generous research budgets, allowing for an accelerated pace of technological progress. The arms and space race drove key innovations, such as advanced rocket systems and satellites, that would later benefit civilian applications and further cement Western military and economic dominance. In the USSR, the conflict with the West was used to justify the creation of the Warsaw Pact in 1955, officially framed as a response to NATO. It also legitimized ongoing rearmament and the permanent militarization of Soviet society. The Cold War cemented Soviet control over Eastern Europe and justified military interventions such as in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, officially to protect socialism from Western influence. The Soviet Union, too, was able to use the threat posed by the Cold War to legitimize high military and research budgets, redirect state resources into strategic sectors, and over the course of the decades-long arms race, benefit from technological advances such as intercontinental missiles, nuclear weapons, satellites, and spaceflight. Another measure was the expansion of intelligence services and the surveillance of the population. In the US, the CIA was founded in 1947, and the surveillance infrastructure was massively expanded. FBI programs like COINTELPRO were launched to target communist elements in the United States. The NSA was created to monitor enemies abroad and at home, but in reality, it led to systematic mass surveillance of the entire population. During the McCarthy era in the 1950s, a campaign was launched to hunt down alleged communists, aiming to intimidate the public and silence dissent. The class enemy was deliberately used as a justification for social control. The anti-communist consensus allowed authorities to suppress domestic opposition, trade unions, and social movements, which were frequently discredited as being infiltrated by communists. In the USSR, the KGB, founded in 1954, was significantly expanded and developed into a global intelligence agency. At the same time, the regime established extensive surveillance of its own population through informants and wiretapping. Critics of the regime were frequently persecuted and intimidated, often accused of being spies for the West. Any form of dissent could be portrayed as Western sabotage or imperialist infiltration, tactics which made it easier to suppress reform movements and opposition. Without a real threat coming from the East-West conflict, these measures were in truth primarily instruments used for political and social control, not for the national defense of the people against an actual external class enemy threatening their existence. Economic measures, state control, and subsidies. After the World War, the United States launched the Marshall Plan. It enabled economic control over Western Europe under the pretext of the communist threat. The military-industrial complex was permanently built, with billions invested in the arms industry. There was also increased control over trade unions and business groups through anti-communist campaigns. In the USSR, there was forced planning and a state economy, justified by the need to be prepared against the capitalist enemy. Massive subsidies were directed to heavy industry and the arms industry, while the civilian economy stagnated. If the East-West conflict in its official form did not correspond to reality and was a lie, then economic management served more as internal control of the economy and society than as defense against a real threat. In this bipolar world, many countries around the globe faced a difficult choice, either to join one of the two blocs or risk being destabilized, economically isolated, or even militarily attacked. Historical examples reveal a clear pattern. Whenever a country does not clearly join Team West or Team East, these reactions typically follow. Regime change attempts, like in Iran, in the year 1953, the CIA and the British MI6 overthrew Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized the British-controlled oil industry and was pursuing an independent national policy. Guatemala, 1954. President Jacobo Arbenz was overthrown because his agrarian reforms threatened U.S. corporate interests, and he pursued a neutral, independent course. Cuba serves as an example of economic pressure being applied. Initially seeking independence, Cuba was pushed by U.S. sanctions and isolation into a close alliance with the Soviet Union. To weaken Castro's now socialist regime, the United States imposed a comprehensive trade embargo. And as a final measure, there were also military interventions in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. The hidden cooperation between East and West. Many historical facts and developments suggest that the Cold War may not have been as antagonistic as officially portrayed. The rigid bipolar world order appears in a different light when we consider the real cooperation between the supposed adversaries. The officially hostile blocs actually cooperated in many areas, from technology transfers to economic and financial support. During World War II, the United States provided large quantities of weapons, raw materials, and technology to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. Remarkably, even after 1945, the Soviet Union continued to receive Western support, particularly in technology and industrial assistance. Many of the factories and production facilities in the Soviet Union were based on American patents and American-built machinery. Companies like General Electric, Ford, and Standard Oil provided technological equipment, even throughout the 1920s and 30s, when the ideological conflict had already begun to take shape. Example: the Ford factories in the Soviet Union. Henry Ford himself was directly involved in the construction of the Gorky automobile plant during the 1930s. This factory would later produce vehicles based on Ford models, which were used by the Soviet military, especially trucks. Historians have demonstrated that Western corporations and government institutions regularly supplied technology to the Soviet Union, even throughout the Cold War period. This raises a fundamental question: why would anyone provide an enemy with the economic means to build a counterbalance to the United States? Western banks, such as J.P. Morgan and the Rockefeller-linked Chase Manhattan Bank, maintained financial ties with the Soviet Union throughout the entire Cold War period. According to historians, loans and financial arrangements continued even during this time, sometimes through concealment strategies. The so-called grain loans of the Nixon administration. In the early 1970s, the United States granted large-scale credit lines to the Soviet Union to finance grain exports. Soviet agriculture was inefficient and depended on Western grain to prevent widespread famine. In 1975, at the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union launched the Apollo-Soyuz test project, in which an American Apollo capsule and a Soviet Soyuz capsule docked in space. This project was not only a technical success, but also a symbol that cooperation in the field of technology was possible. The Cold War, a conflict without true escalation. Also noteworthy, despite all the rhetoric, there was never a direct military conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Instead, there were several proxy wars, Vietnam, Korea, and Afghanistan, that, notably, never truly disrupted the existing global order. Equally noteworthy, despite the doctrine of total war, not a single nuclear weapon was ever used in a direct confrontation. This suggests that the Cold War might not have been a genuine conflict, but rather a long-planned and tightly controlled rivalry that maintained a bipolar world order. Particularly revealing for the thesis of a staged rivalry is the behavior of the United States during the uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Hungarian uprising of 1956. Although the United States rhetorically called for the liberation of Eastern Europe, they did not intervene when the Soviet Union brutally crushed the revolt. Many Hungarians had hoped for Western support, but were bitterly disappointed. Prague Spring of 1968. When Soviet troops moved into Czechoslovakia, in order to suppress the ongoing reform efforts, the United States limited its response to verbal protests only. It took no concrete steps to support the Czechoslovak reform movement. This kind of behavior suggests a silent understanding between the superpowers, indicating that they would respect each other's spheres of influence, regardless of all official public rhetoric. An alternative perspective on the official narrative. The official narrative of the Cold War, as presented in schoolbooks, political speeches, and by mainstream historians, goes as follows. The Cold War was an inevitable conflict between two incompatible systems: the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. The rivalry was real, driven by opposing ideologies, and resulted in proxy wars, espionage, and arms races, until the Soviet Union eventually collapsed in 1991. In this mainstream narrative, the Cold War is generally portrayed as a natural and unavoidable consequence of the Second World War, a kind of ideological, inevitable struggle between democracy and dictatorship, freedom and oppression, market economy and planned economy. Our thesis diverges from the official narrative. Instead of being a spontaneously emerging conflict, several indicators point to the idea that the Cold War was in fact a long-term strategic concept, a means of dividing the global order into two opposing blocs, and thus establishing a stable form of controlled rivalry. Conclusion: the Cold War as an instrument of global control. This critical view of the Cold War leads to a fundamental reinterpretation of this pivotal chapter in world history. Many social, economic, and military measures were justified by a so-called threat that may not have been real. If this threat was artificially created or exaggerated, then these measures were essentially based on a lie, and may have served entirely different purposes than those officially stated. The Cold War was used by both sides to maintain internal control. The constant threat served as justification for surveillance, militarization, and the suppression of dissenting opinions. The United States used the conflict to expand its global power, while the USSR used it to legitimize internal repression and its control over Eastern Europe. Both superpowers benefited from the bipolar world order. The threat presented by the Cold War allowed both power blocs to steadily increase their military and technological capabilities. In both the arms race and the so-called space race, they engaged in a continuous contest for dominance in weapons and advanced technology. They developed nuclear weapons, missile systems such as intercontinental ballistic missiles, and space-based technologies like surveillance satellites. If the mutual threat was merely feigned, then the arms race did not serve, as officially claimed, the purpose of nuclear deterrence against the opposing bloc. In truth, the entire white world, formally divided into the hostile camps of East and West, was massively upgraded in military and technological terms in order to establish a position of global dominance over the rest of the world. The objective was not to arm against each other within the white world, but to jointly arm the entire white world outward, against the non-white world. There is compelling evidence indicating that the Cold War did not simply emerge naturally, but was deliberately used as an instrument of geopolitical and societal control. Rather than being an unavoidable ideological conflict, it may have been a carefully orchestrated scenario, similar to the good cop, bad cop principle, in which both sides beneath the surface were in pursuit of shared strategic interests. The true victims of this possible staging were the ordinary people on both sides of the Iron Curtain. They were deceived, misled, and ultimately turned into victims of a system that, in truth, may have served the preservation of power and control far more than any actual defense. Cold War arms race. The arms race refers to the sustained military and technological buildup between the United States and the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. Both superpowers aimed to secure military superiority, particularly in the fields of nuclear weapons, conventional forces, missile defense systems, and advanced space technology. The objective was to establish mutual deterrence, a strategic concept later known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The underlying idea held that no direct war could ever be won, since both sides possessed sufficient nuclear weapons to annihilate one another. The arms race began after the end of World War II in the 1940s. In this early phase, the major powers started developing nuclear weapons. In 1945, the United States sent a clear signal of military dominance with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, named RDS-1, bringing an end to the U.S. nuclear monopoly. In 1952, the U.S. tested the first hydrogen bomb, a significantly more destructive weapon. The Soviet Union followed in 1953 with its own H-bomb. Conclusion of this phase. The Cold War now clearly enters the nuclear era. Both sides begin sustained and large-scale investments in nuclear weapons systems. From the end of the 1950s, the arms race develops further and expands specifically toward the advancement of rocket technology. In the year 1957, the USSR shocks the world by launching Sputnik, the very first artificial satellite. The United States fears that Soviet rockets will soon be able to carry atomic bombs across the Atlantic Ocean. Both sides begin the development of intercontinental missiles that are capable of transporting nuclear warheads across many thousands of kilometers. Starting in the 1960s, both superpowers developed submarine-based nuclear weapons, known as SLBMs, which enabled a second strike capability. This marked a crucial step toward nuclear deterrence. Even after a first strike, enough firepower would remain to annihilate the enemy. The arms race is officially portrayed as a fierce struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, a duel in which two irreconcilable systems sought to outdo one another with ever more advanced weapon technologies. But what if it was not merely a confrontation, but also a form of global control? An interesting pattern in the arms race is that both sides developed similar weapons systems almost in parallel. The United States had the first atomic bomb in the year 1945. The Soviet Union followed just 4 years later, in 1949. Hydrogen bombs were tested by the United States in 1952 and by the USSR in 1953. Both superpowers developed intercontinental missiles with nuclear warheads simultaneously during the 1950s. Submarine-based nuclear weapons, such as the American Polaris missile and the Soviet R-29, also appeared nearly at the same time, in the 1960s. Both sides additionally worked on satellite surveillance and military space programs. The question is, if this was truly an arms race, why did their developments happen almost entirely in parallel? Coincidence? That's hard to believe, since technological leaps don't usually happen in such perfect sync. Espionage? Of course, there was espionage, for instance through the KGB. But could spying alone have been enough to keep both sides developing at nearly the same pace? Cooperation behind the scenes? Could it be that, despite their open hostility, there was some kind of secret exchange of information, or at least tacit acceptance at a hidden level? The arms race may have been less a genuine conflict between enemies, and more a geopolitically managed system in which both sides were kept at a comparable level of military capability. It may have been a carefully managed rivalry that kept both superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stable. It empowered industries and intelligence agencies, pushed technological innovation forward, and enabled global control through extended proxy wars. The key question is, was the threat of the Cold War real, or was it a vast geopolitical stage play? An important aspect is the military and weapons dependence of other nations. Both blocs, East and West, engaged in massive rearmament during this period and clearly outpaced the rest of the world in weapons systems and technology. Most states in the Middle East, for example, lack a fully independent arms industry, as they have been supplied for decades either by the United States or by Russia. This means they remain strategically dependent in military terms, and that is likely the deeper geopolitical purpose behind these arms deliveries. Since the Cold War, the entire Middle East region has been divided into two military spheres. American weapons were delivered to Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, and the Gulf states. Russian weapons went to Syria and Iran, and until 2003 also to Iraq. This dependence on weapons is intentional because a country with its own arms industry can defend itself. A country that buys weapons remains dependent. When examining the arms race, a broader and quite revealing picture emerges. Nuclear deterrence and the strategic balance between the superpowers formed a system in which the major powers appeared to act in open confrontation, while simultaneously preserving a stable bipolar world order. Under the pretext of the Cold War, both sides had a reason to expand their military capabilities. The entire white world, East and West, was heavily armed and came to possess a level of military and technological power that existed nowhere else outside the white world. It was not about strategic superiority over the ideological opponent, but about military superiority of the entire white world over the rest of the world. States outside the core blocs became clients of the superpowers through strategic arms deliveries, creating a global system of military control that still exists today, even after the formal end of the Cold War. Nuclear war and nuclear threat. The fear of the atomic bomb began with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. This first real use of nuclear weapons was not only the end of the Second World War, but also the beginning of a worldwide fear of nuclear annihilation. Soon after, the destructive power became unmistakably clear, and the first warnings of nuclear war began to surface in both the media and political debate. The United States held a nuclear monopoly until '49, but after the first Soviet atomic test that same year, the arms race, and with it a worldwide fear of nuclear war, truly began. The bomb's destructive power very quickly made nuclear weapons be seen as the ultimate threat. The fear of a so-called nuclear winter was steadily reinforced by both scientists and by the media. The Cold War is perhaps the most significant era in which the threat of nuclear war was steadily built up, both in the United States and in Europe, as well as in the Soviet Union. In the United States in the 1950s, during the presidency of Truman, the concept of massive retaliation was introduced, meaning that every attack would be met with a full and overwhelming nuclear strike. The population in the United States and in Europe was deliberately being conditioned by information campaigns so as to fear a Soviet first strike. The building of air raid shelters and the familiar duck and cover drills in schools were explicitly meant to make the constant threat clearly and constantly felt. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is regarded as the most critical moment of the Cold War. Many believed that a nuclear war was about to break out. News coverage in the Western world created intense fear of a nuclear strike, and many people began to stock supplies or looked for ways to protect themselves. In the late 1970s, tensions rose once again. The NATO double-track decision of 1979 and the Soviet military buildup led to large-scale protests. During the NATO exercise Able Archer in 1983, the Soviet Union even believed that a nuclear first strike was imminent. Western media picked up on this scenario, and the fear of nuclear war among the population grew even further. Ronald Reagan's rhetoric about the evil empire and his aggressive arms buildup further intensified the perception that a nuclear war might in the end become unavoidable. It raises the question, what was intended with all of this? What was the aim of this decades-long campaign of fear? What goals were really being pursued with this nuclear threat, constantly evoked by politics? The fear of a Soviet attack was used as a justification for military buildup. Billions were invested in nuclear weapons, missile systems, and defense technologies. A clear image of the enemy was deliberately created. The population was meant to see the opponent as a looming threat, ensuring social support for their own state. For example, during the McCarthy era of the 1950s, communists were portrayed as traitors and spies, allegedly preparing the destruction of America. In the Soviet Union, on the other hand, the United States was depicted as imperialist aggressors, ready to strike at any moment. Through the nuclear threat, governments gained legitimacy for expanding intelligence services, surveillance and control of the population, and the introduction of emergency laws. During the Cold War, there were laws in the United States that allowed extensive surveillance in order to identify spies. In the Soviet Union, under the pretext of a Western threat, an all-encompassing system of surveillance was created. The KGB carried out so-called preventive measures to silence critical voices at an early stage. Governments exploited the panic to legitimize surveillance programs that would, under normal circumstances, likely have been rejected. The fear of nuclear war thus served as a tool to enforce the rise of a surveillance state. Suppressing opposition and peace movements. Those who protested against nuclear policy were often portrayed as naive, or even as collaborators of the enemy. The Reagan administration in the 1980s labeled opponents of nuclear weapons as unrealistic or as agents of Soviet influence. In 1983, protests against the Pershing II missiles in Germany were denounced as communist-controlled. With the fear of nuclear war, people could be intimidated and controlled, and made more receptive to authoritarian measures. With the so-called doomsday clock starting in 1947, scientists kept the world on constant alert, using this symbolic clock to signal just how close humanity was thought to be to the brink of nuclear war. The Duck and Cover campaign in the United States, beginning in 1951, conveyed the feeling that an attack could be survived if one behaved correctly. The Protect and Survive campaign in Britain during the 1970s offered instructions for building emergency shelters, but faced heavy criticism for suggesting unrealistic chances of survival. In the end, an entire generation was raised under a constant sense of threat. Children who grew up with duck and cover were shaped by the feeling that the world could end at any moment. This created stress, but also obedience. Psychological studies from the 1980s show that many young people felt helpless, fearful, and without any sense of future because of the nuclear threat. This sense of powerlessness encouraged either resignation or blind activism. Both of these reactions could be taken advantage of by those in power, whether to dismiss anti-nuclear protests as hysterical or to nurture a no-future attitude that slowed down fundamental change. The fear of nuclear war was not only communicated as a real threat, but was also used as a useful political instrument. Through the fear of the bomb, the state became more powerful, while the citizen became more controllable. Surveillance, the restriction of civil rights, and militarization were accepted as so-called necessary measures. The alternative interpretation sees a clear pattern in this. Threats, whether real or exaggerated, serve to steer the masses. They provide the justification for surveillance, rearmament, and obedience. The fear of nuclear war was, in the 20th century, perhaps the most powerful of such specters, creating trauma and conformity across generations, and it was used by both sides, East and West, as the foundation for justifying their policies. Space race, the hidden agenda of space conquest. Closely connected to the arms race is another significant chapter that helped shape the long years of the Cold War. The ambitious race into space, the so-called space race, is described in official history as a central part of the Cold War, with the United States and the Soviet Union steadily competing for technological and scientific supremacy in outer space. This race began in the 1950s and ultimately reached its peak with the moon landing in the year 1969. The official starting signal for the space race came on the 4th of October 1957, when the USSR launched Sputnik 1 into space, the very first artificial satellite in the world. This so-called Sputnik shock led in the United States to the founding of NASA in the year 1958 and to massive investments in space exploration. The Soviet Union dominated the early phase of the race. November 1957. Sputnik 2 carries the dog Laika into space. 12th of April, 1961. Yuri Gagarin is sent into space aboard Vostok 1 as the very first human being. The United States responded with the Mercury program, and on the 5th of May 1961, sent Alan Shepard as the very first American into space, although it was only a brief suborbital flight. After the initial setback, U.S. President John F. Kennedy formally announced in May 1961 the highly ambitious goal to land a man on the moon and to return him safely to the Earth before the decade is out. With Apollo 8, in the year 1968, came the very first manned orbit of the moon. On the 20th of July, 1969, with Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first human beings to set foot on the moon. Official historiography views the moon landing as a decisive victory for the United States in the space race, and it also marks the end of the intense competition. The race for space, it is said, thus gave way to American strength, determination, and innovative power, while the Soviet space program, despite its early successes, ultimately failed. A striking pattern of the space race is that both the United States and the Soviet Union developed similar technologies almost simultaneously, which seems unusual for a true rivalry. 1945. Both sides recruit German rocket scientists. After the Second World War, both the United States and the Soviet Union took over German rocket scientists and the V-2 technology that had been developed by Wernher von Braun and his team in Nazi Germany. From 1955 to 1957, both superpowers worked in parallel on satellite programs. From 1957 to 1958, the Soviets launched Sputnik, and only a few months later the United States announced the Mercury program. 1961. Gagarin flies into space. Shortly afterward, Alan Shepard follows. 1969. The United States lands on the moon. At the very same time, the Soviet Union suddenly abandons its lunar program. A critical analysis suggests that the space race was in fact a strategically coordinated system that served several purposes. Civilian space travel legitimized the development of rocket technology that was primarily of military significance. At the same time, the space race made massive investments in the military-industrial complex possible. The key technology of the space race, rocket engineering, had a clear dual purpose from the very beginning. It could carry human beings into space, but could also direct nuclear warheads toward enemy cities. This dual-use nature is essential for understanding the true character of the space race. The space programs of both superpowers were built on the very same technological foundation: the German V-2 rocket from the Second World War. The German V-2 rocket from the 1940s was the very first operational long-range rocket and was developed by the Nazis as a weapon of vengeance. In 1957, the Soviet Union completed the R-7 Semyorka, the first intercontinental missile in the world. This rocket was later used for the launch of Sputnik and for Gagarin's spaceflight. The United States developed the Atlas rocket in the 1950s as an intercontinental missile for nuclear warheads. Later, it served as the launch vehicle for the Mercury program. The Titan II of the 1960s was also a strategic missile, later used for the manned Gemini missions. The Saturn V of the 1960s, the Apollo moon rocket, was built using knowledge, infrastructure, and personnel from the earlier military missile programs. The crucial point is this: the rockets could be used for satellites as well as for nuclear warheads. Yet in public, almost only the civilian side was shown. Space travel as progress, as a scientific and technological race. For the development of intercontinental missiles was politically sensitive. Domestically, because nuclear first-strike weapons were hard to justify, and internationally because open rearmament threatened the balance. The space race legitimized the enormous spending on rocket technology, not as part of the arms race, but as a scientific pioneering achievement. What was militarily sensitive was sold as progress. The space race turned rockets into carriers of science, not of destruction. Space travel depoliticized highly sensitive military programs and staged them as a triumph of science and human progress. While public attention was fixed on manned space flights and the landing on the moon, programs for the ongoing development of spy satellites were quietly unfolding in the background. The true strategic priority of the superpowers, along with the rocket technology that was required for military intercontinental missiles. The top-secret Corona program by the CIA was the world's first systematic satellite espionage system. Corona satellites took photographs of Soviet territory using high-performance cameras. The satellites ejected film capsules with parachutes, which were caught mid-air by U.S. military aircraft. Corona provided more information about Soviet military installations than all spy planes before it. The program remained classified until 1995, longer than the Apollo program. The Soviet Union ran its own spy satellite program at the same time, in parallel. Zenit satellites, from 1961, were perceived by the public as scientific research satellites, but in reality they were in fact high-resolution reconnaissance satellites. The Almaz program in the 1970s was essentially a military space station for the direct observation of NATO activities. The true priority of the space programs lay in surveillance from space. Satellites made it possible to enable the continuous monitoring of troop movements, missile silos, and military infrastructure. Surveillance satellites for early warning systems in orbit could detect missile launches on Earth at a very early stage, and in this way provide timely warnings of attacks. Satellites could also verify and confirm whether disarmament treaties were being upheld. The military and geopolitical value of these systems clearly and significantly exceeded the scientific benefit of manned spaceflight. The space race is often portrayed as a scientific endeavor or even as an ideological competition. A critical analysis, however, shows that it was primarily an instrument for gaining geopolitical control, not over outer space, but ultimately over the Earth itself. Since the end of the Cold War, the release of formerly classified documents has shed new light on the space race and confirmed many of the critical theses regarding the military and geopolitical nature of the competition for space. The CIA released details of the Corona program, the very first spy satellite program, which ran in parallel with the Mercury and Gemini programs. Declassified Pentagon reports show that military planners considered the moon to be strategically worthless and instead prioritized satellite technology. Soviet documents released after 1991 revealed the primarily military focus of their own space program. Behind the facade of scientific competition, the space race pursued geopolitical objectives. It was primarily a geopolitical instrument of power, not a purely scientific undertaking. It served mainly military and strategic purposes, not the exploration of outer space. It was closely linked to the strategy of nuclear deterrence. Intercontinental ballistic missiles with their nuclear warheads could reach any point on Earth within just a few minutes. The control of near-Earth space made possible global surveillance and communication monopolies. Satellites could observe every single region of the Earth without ever violating national airspace boundaries. Whoever dominated satellite communication ultimately controlled the worldwide flow of information. Weather forecasting through satellites also offered enormous strategic and economic advantages. Manned spaceflight, and especially the moon landing, were possibly more like side products and prestigious distractions from the real objectives: nuclear deterrence, global surveillance, and strategic dominance. Conclusion: the space race did not primarily serve the exploration of outer space. It was not a race to the moon, but rather a struggle for the control of the Earth from space. It was not primarily a scientific undertaking, but an instrument of military and geopolitical power, disguised as the peaceful exploration of space. Both sides, East and West, engaged in a race under the pretext of the Cold War, and at the same time developed the very same technologies and capabilities. The White World was now technologically able to control the entire globe from space, through rockets and satellites. The bipolar world order of the Cold War, and its continuation in today's geopolitical conflicts, may be less the result of ideological differences and more a deliberately staged system of domination, in which both superpowers in truth cooperated while merely pretending hostility. When one takes a macro view and examines our history over the past decades, many clues can be identified that support this thesis. The parallel developments in the fields of technology, the military, and space exploration. The absence of any real escalation into open war, neither conventional nor nuclear. There were only proxy wars, and those only in regions beyond their own white world. The control structures that were expanded in both blocks, by which entire populations were observed and administered. The fate of states that tried to pursue an independent course outside of these two blocks. Contradictions, such as the hidden cooperation between East and West. All of this strongly suggests a system in which the supposed hostility may well be more facade than reality. Viewed in this light, the division of the world into two opposing blocks may have primarily served the purpose of expanding the white world to its utmost level, both technologically and militarily. East and West moved in lockstep with their technological and military efforts, clearly distancing themselves, both technologically and militarily, from all other non-white regions of the world. They built military and geopolitical dominance against the outside, beyond the white world. Under the pretext of the East-West conflict, each side also increasingly monitored and controlled its own population. Society itself was restructured within a newly framed world order. The true independence of nations was repeatedly obstructed, and much of the world was steadily drawn into this system of the two blocks. If we assume that the East-West conflict was deliberately staged, important consequences emerge for the world order we live in today. The story we have been told about the Cold War would be a deliberate deception. The people in East and West would have been systematically manipulated for decades, with fabricated enemy images that were not real. All major political, economic, and social measures that were justified by the Cold War would, in reality, have had completely different aims, and would have been built upon a deliberate lie. Entire generations were re-educated and manipulated to accept a false world order. This manipulation had far-reaching consequences. In both blocs, people believed the lies about the enemy. And not only there. This lie of an enmity between the two white superpowers was spread across the world. If history was distorted, then today's political decisions are built on that distortion, with long-term consequences. This is not just a historical subject, it has direct effects on our society today and on the way politics operates. The state perfected its total control over society. The Cold War served as the perfect pretext to construct surveillance states. Mass surveillance, intelligence services, social control, and propaganda were refined and expanded during that period. These systems were never dismantled. They still exist to this day. The lie of the Cold War has created the permanent system of control we are living in today. The entire world order is built on a construct, not on chance or democracy. The Cold War created a world order divided into two blocks, with the United States as the dominant power. If the threat of the Soviet Union never truly existed, then this order was not built on freedom, but rather on manipulation. This means the world was shaped from the very beginning according to a long-term and deliberate plan, not through natural developments. Democracy, international institutions, and alliances, such as NATO or the UN, all of this was not created for the people, but as part of a strategy of long-term geopolitical control. It raises the question, why this lie? To answer that, we may first need to examine another, deeper question. Namely, how else could the technological, military, and geopolitical leadership of the white world possibly have been enforced? You cannot openly tell people, we must develop and build weapons so that we can ensure long-term dominance over other continents and peoples. Many people would not have understood or accepted such a statement. And beyond that, it would have amounted to an unmistakable and open declaration of war against the populations of other regions of the world. Openly communicating and declaring such an intention would have prompted other nations or civilizations to unite closely and take countermeasures. An alliance against a civilization openly striving for dominance, in this case the white world, would very likely have emerged. The solution to this supposed dilemma was a fictional conflict, the so-called Cold War, or East-West conflict. Within this staged enmity, the white nations fought one another, at least officially. Instead of saying, we need weapons technology to be globally dominant, the argument was, we need weapons to defend ourselves against the evil communists or capitalists. This allowed for a rapid technological and military buildup, without the true motives ever being questioned. It is striking that both the arms race and the space race followed the exact same logic of a competition. Both races had primarily military and strategic significance, ran conspicuously in parallel, were justified in the same way, and ended with the very same final result. Both sides had developed technologies and military capabilities that existed nowhere outside the white world. The same applies to the new world order that emerged after the end of the World War and was cemented during the Cold War. All the new institutions and organizations, the entire system of control and surveillance, and the intelligence services. All of this was officially created to protect against an enemy. In the East, they claimed to protect themselves against the West, and in the West, against the East. Without an enemy, the justification for all of these measures would have disappeared, and the populations would likely not have accepted them. Against many of the innovations and restrictions, the growing interventions of the state, the totalitarian control and surveillance, there would have been resistance. Also, the danger of a nuclear war between the two superpowers, repeatedly raised over the past decades, would then have been a lie, the entire time. Both sides used the same psychological warfare against their own people. Both superpowers relied on fear and intimidation as a strategy to control their populations. This went as far as the mass media construction of an overwhelming image of nuclear annihilation, suggesting that the two superpowers, armed to the teeth, would destroy one another in a nuclear war, and that humanity itself would then descend into a devastating nuclear winter. They used this system to control us and our families, keeping everyone under their rule for decades. If the two superpowers were only fighting a fictional battle, there was never any real danger of escalation, and therefore no real danger of a total nuclear annihilation of the world. This supposed threat scenario had, for all those decades, always been nothing but a lie and a deception. It was a stage-managed menace, shown to us again and again, but in truth it had no connection to reality. Conclusion: living in a constructed reality. What does it mean for our understanding of the world if the Cold War was, in fact, a constructed rivalry? If the Cold War was a lie, then this means the following: everything that was built upon it is equally a deception. Our understanding of history, politics, and democracy is therefore not the outcome of natural development, but of carefully planned power structures. For many decades, people were deliberately kept in fear to create a global order that is not founded on freedom, but on control. This means that, even today, we are still living within a system that was built upon that very lie. Making this documentary took several months of intensive full-time work. If it moved you or you learned something new, please consider supporting my work. I can then continue this project and produce additional parts. Otherwise, I simply won't be able to continue. I'd be incredibly grateful for any donation, big or small. I fully expect this to get shadow banned to limit the reach of this content. Please like, subscribe, and share the video. That helps me maintain visibility even under shadow banning.